Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm starting to feel like a little bit like I'm running my own TV show now. So yeah, this is getting comfortable with it. Hopefully the technology holds up. It's Saturday afternoon, so I hope you got your feet up somewhere. I hope you're looking out over a green space, or playing with the kids, or in a good place. And if you're not, sending lots of love and support from all of this gorgeous community that are here in the Department of Dreams. So I'm really excited about this afternoon's conversation. In a second, you'll see where Suzanne is currently sitting, and we're going to share it to spread joy. Okay, not to spread like envy or jealousy, to spread joy at the beauty of this incredible planet. But I'll save that for a second and introduce our next guest. So Suzanne Dhaliwal is someone who I've admired from afar for a long time. She is literally and metaphorically always on the front lines of the things that we need to be fighting for and caring about. And she reminds me often about things that are just being ignored as well. So the session today is called Recentering Climate Justice. And what we're going to be thinking about in the session with Suzanne is, how do we imagine a recentered climate justice movement? And to just tell you a little bit about Suzanne, Suzanne's worked alongside the Ogoni people and British-Nigerian artist Sokari Douglas-Camp to send a life-size bust sculpture to Nigeria for the 20th anniversary of the execution of the Ogoni 9 in Ken Saro Wiwa with platform. She was part of the Art Not Oil coalition for 6 years, challenging BP and Shell's corporate sponsorship in the arts, and then went on to complete a Master of Arts in Social Sculpture in Oxford to address the lack of representation and ongoing white supremacy in the UK climate justice movement. So today is definitely set to be a thought-provoking and important conversation. And so I'm looking forward to picking up on some of those examples as well, and hearing more about Suzanne's work and what's bothering her right now. And if nothing is, then we're obviously going to be on a great track, but I'm pretty sure there's a lot. So we've got just over an hour to really get into that. And to say, Suzanne's a climate justice campaigner, a queer advocate, a provocateur, an interdisciplinary artist and lecturer. And you can follow her on Twitter at Zuzanne, ZOOZANNE. So on that note, welcome, Suzanne. And before you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your work for sort of the next 10 minutes, give us a look at where you are, because you know what, it's for joy, okay? So don't you all start piling onto the chat and being angry with Suzanne. Let's have a moment to take in where she is, and tell us where you are as well, Suzanne.
Sure, a bee just came in. So I'm just in Tuscany. So I'm just 2 hours outside of Florence, and actually to the side of us is the mountain Laverna, where Francis of Assisi actually founded the Franciscan order. And I'm at a hotel and a community that's emerged to, bring a sustainable approach to tourism in the area. And I'm actually here because my partner is an architect, and they were paid in staying here. So we came as I actually had COVID in March, and I've been in that healing process. So we came to just have a little bit of a bit of healing to be able to continue the work. So I'm really happy to be able to meet you, Immy, because as you said, we've been sort of following each other for a long time. So I'm really happy to have this conversation with you. So I'll just kick off from there. So my work has started actually in terms of climate justice. I actually came into this work more from humanitarianism and looking at the interface of extractivism, mining and indigenous communities. So that work started with Médecins Sans Frontières and looking at the mental health impacts of mining on indigenous communities, because often they are what's considered the fourth world. Because often indigenous communities are displaced, undergoing intimidation and in their own territories, and often they don't cross borders, so they don't often even get the same protections as refugees or internally displaced people. So initially my work was around that, and then in around 2008 I started to research and started to understand the the inevitability of peak oil. And at that point I thought that we would hit peak oil and we would begin to transition off. I didn't anticipate that instead we would start moving into fracking and heavy oil. And so at that point, I started to challenge Doctors Without Borders and ask about, where is the place of talking about climate change and Indigenous rights? And it was quite a difficult conversation. And that was where I started to learn the skills of questioning organizations from within, holding those conversations, pushing those questions around that. But it became very much a case in 2007, 2008, that you couldn't really talk about climate change in Canada. You could not talk about Indigenous rights. It was very taboo, and I didn't know at the time why. And then I actually had a dream. I had a dream to leave Canada, because I'm a Brummie, but I moved to Canada when I was 11 and was studying there and worked there. And I had this dream to go back to the UK. And so I followed it, and I left all my belongings and actually moved back to the UK and was living in transition towns, Tinker's Bubble, in Yeovil, all sorts of transition communities, to learn about how to survive peak oil and what that might look like. And when I was there, I actually started to learn about the fact that in Canada, there was a huge deposit of oil called tar sands that was being extracted in Alberta, that was on the territory of Indigenous communities. And it was absolutely shocking to understand, but also put the pieces together, that this was why Canada was silencing any conversations about climate change, because it's heavy oil, highly polluting, and also it's on the territories of Indigenous communities. So then I actually started, ran out of money in Tinker's Bubble and started to work at Survival International, which is an Indigenous rights organisation. And there kind of came up against the same battles that I'd experienced at MSF, where, the organisation didn't want to talk about developed Indigenous groups. It was more about pristine Indigenous communities that look good in The Guardian. So I was told to stop talking about the tar sands, to stop researching it. The executive director actually, told me that I would never stop this and to stop talking about it. So that just sort of riled me up. I was like, now I'm going to go hard. So I was very lucky that at that point I made contact with the Indigenous Environmental Network and frontline communities there. And we actually set up our own organisation called the UK Tar Sands Network in 2009. So in 2009, UK Tar Sands Network became an anchor organisation to support Indigenous communities to confront and expose the investments of BP Shell, Royal Bank of Scotland in those projects, and also to use the privilege of being in London and having access to that media space to internationalise the situation that was going on there. And so for me, as a Sikh woman who's British born, but also, my family moved to Canada, I sort of sit between being both, a person of colour in the UK and all that brings, but also a settler colonial when it comes to being in Canada. So my role has been really to sort of work with that privilege, the access that I had to those corporate shareholder meetings, and to work with them. So since 2009, we built an international campaign that was kind of the foundations for a lot of the divestment work that happened. But the difference was, when we were calling for corporations to divest from tar sands, we were doing it from an Indigenous rights framework. So that means that, as well as calling for BP and Shell to divest from highly polluting climate bombs, basically, that we were doing it from the framework that those projects did not have the free, prior and informed consent of those communities, and they were actually illegal and violating the treaties of those communities. So that work carried on. But as you can imagine, the environmental movement doesn't have, especially at that time, did not have any people that looked like me in that space. There were maybe 3 of us. And so, as well as doing the campaigning work, organizing, mass amounts of speaker tours, media work, direct action, shutting down petrol stations. Suddenly, I also was given this task of being an anti-white supremacy trainer, because in order to get the environmental movement to understand colonialism and the role of extraction and the London Stock Exchange, it meant doing history work around colonialism, around white supremacy, diversity of tactics. So that kind of became, a job unto itself. And eventually, I really sort of got quite burnt out by that work. And as you mentioned, Immy, that's when I sort of turned to art as a refuge and as a way to seek community outside of activism, because I found that there wasn't really much space for reflection or for referring to these things. So that was where I started working around finding dialogue processes and alluding to creative strategies that could address white supremacy, and instead of it just being a conversation that went nowhere, but really coming up with concrete strategies of how we can move that forward. And so since then, I've sort of been working in different spaces and changed towards being more of a consultant as well, and looking at going deeper into the financial work of that as well. So also looking at insurance and how insurance continues to underwrite coal and tar sands. So trying to get the insurance sector to no longer underwrite fossil fuel projects. So a lot of the time I'm behind the scenes and instigating or setting up campaigns. And then, as you mentioned, then, one of the ways that I thought we could also address the issue of representation was to become more of a producer. So I worked with the Muslim Invention podcast, worked with different writers in Hollywood in their writers' tables to bring around some of these thinkings from the beginning around not just adding colour and stir, our sin for diversity, but thinking about how we can be in that conversation and deep within that, and also using digital media to increase our visibility as well. So that's what I've been up to, and that brings us kind of to here.
That's what you've casually been up to over such a longer period of time. Thank you, Suzanne, for sharing that. And yeah, like I think I've heard you talk quite a lot about being one of the first, women of colour in a lot of the movements that were trying to really question, especially like the institutional investments and all of that. And I've known your name and seen your face come up quite a lot over the years in that. And so let's start there on the personal, and then I've got loads of things, and especially talking about insurance and underwriting. I can see Andy in the chat, who I know's eyes would have lit up when he heard you talk about insurance. So bring your questions in live for Suzanne, because I'm going to be asking her all the way throughout this conversation. There's not going to be a set Q&A section. It's just going to be a nice flowing coffee between us both conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. So ask your questions, please. So yeah, let's go back a minute, and let's go back to those early days, and you being one of the only people like you in the movement, and challenging multiple structures in the NGO space, going to multiple different spaces and seeing the same thing happen. You being silenced even within the spaces that should be like absolutely fighting for the work. And you talk about burnout. Tell us about those early days and those battles, and what you see are the parallel struggles and battles now. I see you talk quite a lot about, for example, the climate movement and XR and the critiques and the challenges. Like, what was going on there, and what do you think is the challenge? What was going on when you first were working in this space, and how are some of those challenges not gone away, even though it feels like the climate movement in one way is right all up in our faces now everywhere we look? What's going on, and how did you have you navigated that journey?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest compass that kept me aligned was spirituality, and was the relationship that I had with the Indigenous communities. And there was this feeling that there was a spiritual relationship. There was a spiritual reason why my family moved me to Canada, that I had to witness that and to come back and be in that allyship. So a lot of the time I didn't actually, there weren't any mentors, like there wasn't anyone around me who was showing me what to do. So a lot of the time it was having that, the Sikh faith of seva, of solidarity, that navigated me through that. And I think, you know, when I came into the nonprofit realm, like with Survival International, I think at the beginning, I wasn't quite ready for the level of intimidation that happens when you question it. For instance, when I was asked to leave Survival, I was, you know, removed from the building, my hard drives taken away, told not to contact any of the staff again. And that was quite alarming for me. And so very early on, I sort of realized that actually in order to make it to 40, I wouldn't be able to work in those offices and those spaces. And I would have to become an entrepreneur and an innovator and not necessarily work in that space. So, you know, sometimes I would even do direct actions for big organizations to make money, to fund my organization. So there was all these ways of sort of coming into that work differently. And also then I think a big part was, you know, I literally started the organization out of my, you know, bedroom in Streatham. And I think that's where I learned so much about who we consider activists. You know, oftentimes it would be my partner and being like, okay, let's graphic design this, and ask my sister to get the sheets and to do, you know, do our prayers around the sheets and to turn those into banners, always bringing that faith into it, because also as a person of color, I couldn't get arrested. Also, my mum would kill me if I got arrested. So there was, you know, there was always this culture around, we're not doing this to get arrested. We're trying to be protected. We're trying to be safe. So I think for me, there was definitely this education around spiritual activism, around protection. But very early on when we set up the UK Tarsons Network, it was very difficult to be seen as a leader. And even now, I think because I'm sure, and all those different things, there's this thing within that sector where people would be like, well, where's the CEO of UK Tarsons Network? I'm like, oh, I'm here. So, you know, there's really a difficult, it's difficult to be seen as leadership, to be respected for your intellectual involvement. And there's been a real big co-option of that work. So, you know, a lot of the divestment work that we did was co-opted and whitewashed by 350.org. And I think that's something that's continued. And I think, you know, even now it's very, even though we see more climate activism and we see more nods to climate justice, in terms of who's actually resourced to do the work, who's acknowledged as the leaders in this space, in the UK and in Europe, it's still very difficult to be taken seriously as leadership. And I think that's the thing, like, even if we're more visible or if we're more on podcasts and all these things, we still don't have the access to resources. Like, I still don't have a full-time salary to do this work. So I think even that's a big question around, okay, so even though we're more visible, there's more organizing, it's actually become more difficult now, because back in 2009, you know, this stuff was new, it was kind of edgy, it was different, and so we could get that funding. But now the space is saturated. And also, I think it's created a lot of lateral violence between us as well. I think, you know, there's often this idea that we are homogenous as people of colour. So if there's a person of colour there, then they're speaking from the same space. And that's been another challenge for me in terms of what I mean by decolonisation in the context of climate justice and Indigenous allyship versus what we often talk about as decolonisation as British-based people of colour as well. So that's kind of a tension that's continued there. So I think I'd say that the difference is there's less fluidity, there's less flexibility to get access to those resources. And to be honest, sometimes it was easier to have those conversations back in the day with Climate Camp and Reclaim the Power. There was a learning, there was a relationship, there was friendships. And I find that with XR and those groups, because we don't actually know who they are or who's funding them or where it's come from, it's a lot more harder to have those conversations now. So I find many of us have retreated actually from a lot of the work that we used to do.
Okay, let's stay there for a minute. Imagine the audience are like just arrived. Maybe say half the audience are just arriving to this conversation and they're like, okay, I don't I don't understand. Let's go back to some basics and ask some clear questions, right? So tell me about what your view is on what's the balance between co-option. Yesterday, Diane Rusin, an Indigenous leader from Winnipeg in Canada, in Manitoba, talked about the difference between being appropriate and appropriating, and that gentle balance, right, of what that looks like, and how it all centers back to like being in relationship with your relations and seeing your relations as beyond the human. And if you can get that right, you can start to understand the balance of what is appropriation and what's appropriate.
Yeah.
So we've got, let's imagine like the mainstream messages that we're all hearing right now. There's a massive urgency of this problem of what is happening with the climate. We need to act fast and urgently and hard and quickly and in every different direction, right? And then I know the answer to this, and I want to ask some more questions about why it's so important to centre Black, Indigenous people of colour in this work. But talk to us about what is the balance between co-option, appropriation, being appropriate, and acting urgently? How do you think about this challenge?
Yeah, so to give a concrete example, I actually had a friend who was an ally within Wretched of the Earth who stole my campaign for Greenpeace UK. So literally the designs, the language and everything was literally stolen. So there was actually an intellectual property lawsuit, which I could have carried out against Greenpeace, but I chose to settle it out of court. So that's what I mean when I talk about appropriation, the literal theft of campaigns, of intellectual property. And that's something that really happens quite regularly in the environmental movement. So when we're talking about intellectual property theft, I mean literal theft of work. And then I see where you're going with that conversation, because I often struggle with it as well, because it's like, well, we want everyone to be holding these messages and moving them forward. But the problem is, I think it comes down to a labour space. When the people who have been carrying these messages have been, I've been talking about white supremacy when it wasn't cool, when it got me, ostracized from my community, made me lose my jobs. And so now it's a lot easier to talk about that. So those people who have positions of power, who have access to resources, need to look backwards and just say, okay, the people who got us to this point, are they okay? Can they pay rent? Can they eat food? Are they safe? Do they need mental health? So it's very much, I mean it on a care level of caring about the women of colour who took a fall, who took that abuse. And some of us didn't really make it. When that happened to me, I was in a suicidal depression from having both an ally and a friend steal my work, and the mental impacts of both being a campaigner and, trying to shut down insurance conferences after a terror attack, and then also having this other pain and wound of having your work stolen from you, and and I couldn't even get a lawyer. I had to fight that case myself. So when we're talking about appropriation and theft, I mean literally how the industry works. For instance, with 350.org, we were doing years of divestment work with this framework. But when 350 expanded and grew up in Europe, they didn't necessarily work with us. They appropriated the language, they appropriated some of the strides that we'd made. So it's literally about how you collaborate. It's how you resource the people who've been doing that in a grassroots way, which is still, sophisticated and that. So it's very much about, I think, labour. The representation of labour, and also lateral violence that happens within our communities. Those of us who are white passing are often seen as more, especially Latinx community, are seen as more intellectual within the environmental movement. And then, so there's this whole ways in which we harm each other in this space. And I think that's where we have to take a stop and a breather, and in the urgency, not say, well, anything goes because there's such an emergency. It's like we've been in this emergency for 500 years. The devastation of indigenous territories, the desecration of the land, extractivism, this is a long story. So I think sometimes that language of urgency, which exile uses. It's like, well, maybe it's urgent for you because you just woke up, but some of us have been in this. So I think sometimes time and urgency is used as a way to justify erasure, theft. Yeah, so I think that's how I see it, is very much on a care and labour level.
Thanks, Suzanne, and especially around that, giving language to some of the kind of, I think what I struggle a lot with is that there is an urgent piece to this about temperature increase and all of that, right? And absolutely, all of us, or many of us, are fully behind that conversation. But the idea that, like you said, that it's something that we've just woken up to in the last few years. I mean, I'm not saying this myself, because I definitely think I've woken up in the last 10 years to what I didn't realize what was happening, or what my childhood or education didn't allow me to understand or access in a meaningful way. And I think that when you frame it in that space of like, this is an emergency that has been going on for hundreds of years, that's been just taking lots of different forms. What I can often see is that emergency language from the mainstream movement is used to then say, yeah, well, that's why we behave like that. That's why we're not doing this. And I think that's the delicate balance that I'm really interested in, is that like, we can both be in constant emergency, or like Indy talked about yesterday, the long emergency that we're in and we have been in, and so many communities have been disproportionately in for such a long time. And the balance of that compared to, you know, the ongoing urgent other things and parts of this story that we need to tackle, and where it's used as a way to silence and to justify like behavior that doesn't center those most impacted by this. So what I want to kind of ask you on my second and last, like back to basics questions before we go into some detail about insurance and other fantastic things, is what does it mean for you to center climate justice? What does that mean for you when you say recentering climate justice? And what does it mean to you when you talk about centering the voices that are most impacted and that have been in emergency for multiple centuries? What does that look like in your world?
Yeah, so recentering is actually a concept by Indigenous academic called Andrea Smith, and I work with her concept around that. And so it's recentering is literally a process of looking at the crisis and the situation and who has been most impacted by that. So if we look at climate justice, and if we look at the fact that one of the biggest things that we have to do is keep fossil fuels in the ground. And if you lay over a map of where those territories are, where the fossil fuels are, and the communities that are living on them or have treaty rights to protect them, it's predominantly Indigenous communities. So when we're looking at it, you know, if you want to do it from a sole perspective or a strategic perspective, on a strategic perspective, centering Indigenous people is what we need to do, because they also are custodians of 80% of the global biodiversity. So when we're talking about climate justice, without having Indigenous people, we're not even doing that work, for me. And the UN acknowledges that, you know, without Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, without the central role of Indigenous people, we can't actually tackle this crisis. And yet there aren't any actually Indigenous rights within the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is basically not worth the paper it's written on. It doesn't have any Indigenous rights. It doesn't have any human rights in it. So recentering means bringing ourselves back to those struggles. Who has been leading the struggles to keep the tar sands in the ground, the Ogoni people, to stop the ecocide that is happening? So I think that's a really important point to bring back in as well, what you said about going from parts per million and this future scenario to the ecocide. Because when we talk about ecocide, we're talking about destruction that's already happened, devastation, and legal cases against these corporations that have been in play. So recentering means to hold our agenda, to decolonize, to think maybe we don't have the strategies, maybe somebody else already had those strategies. That's a really intellectual decolonizing that has to happen. And then as well as that, I think, you know, as we've seen now, it's recentering means to constantly look around you. Are the things that our trans siblings are telling us are not happening in the movement? Are we hearing them? Are we listening? Are we, you know, adapting them? Are we in this place of softness where instead of being defensive or annoyed at them, do we say, okay, we hear you, and we are doing the soft work to constantly recenter? So for me, recentering is a constant process of both looking at those decolonial strategies, making sure at the front of them, and they're also, it's a live process as well as constantly being in relationship, listening and responding.
Thank you, Suzanne. Especially when some of, so obviously lots of that is new to me from hearing it from you, but also lots is you doing the work of kind of re-educating and making sure people remember where, you know, where we're at. And I'm going to move the conversation shortly into like more of the work you're currently doing. I want to talk about Cyclone in that we talked about a few months ago, and about like, because rightly for lots of reasons you were angry, but you were also angry for deeper reasons. And I want you to talk about what happened with that and how it was reported, and why the way we ignored it and the media ignored it was so deeply troubling. But before we kind of go into some work now where you're finding hope, some of the things that you're working on, one of the things that I find often, and because I know we've got quite a mixed audience, and so I'd like you to kind of speak to it once and for all, is this kind of, and I don't mean once and for all, but, you know, let's just name it, right? So there's a lot of, linked to your last question, I often find on your Facebook, on your last answer on your Facebook, people are just piling into fights, right? Every single time you want to say something about XR, right? And you like, one criticism then like turns into like, or a critique, not even a criticism, right? A critique or like, this is not okay, this is not good enough, turns into this massive, like, at least they're doing something. So like, how dare you kind of like say anything about it? And I mean, as a whole, that idea is ridiculous anyway, because the fact that somebody's doing something can't be a way to not be able to critique the movement. But talk about XR directly a bit more, right? Where are the challenges? Where are the challenges, particularly for those who are most impacted by climate change and the ongoing emergency we've been in? Why is it such a problem that we don't know where XR is like funded from? What's going on? That it's largely quite a white movement. Talk to us about this a little bit, because I feel like your entire thread sometimes is just people coming in and being like, yes, but you don't understand, right? And it's kind of like, this is your platform, so let's talk from your point of view. This is your conversation, and tell us about that a little bit more.
Yeah, okay, this is my least favorite topic, but I'll do it. So I think for me, with XR, literally, and I'm joking, I'm not joking, but I think part of recentering and part of challenging white supremacy is often when people ask me about XR, and I'm like, you know what, ask me about anything else, ask me about insurance, ask me about my organization that's been going for so many years. And I think that's the first part about this, is why do all of the conversations have to center about me going to visit them in Stroud and getting them educated and getting them, you know, on point? I think that's part of the movement, her story, history work that we have to do, is to understand that we have ancestors. You know, I come from Rajasthan. There's a Bishnoi community that have been protecting nature for eons. So I think the first step is, you know, looking to our ancestry and putting it on a timeline, and like, this is a blip. This is like 2 years since Greta and XR showed up. So that's the first thing, put it into a timeline. And then I think the other thing is that they did that. They erased that history. You know, they were like, took credit for creating that movement. And I think, so we have to think about how was that stage set for them to come up. And then also it's about this energy, you know, all the energy that goes into critiquing XR, to doing that. It burnt out so many of us mentally that we gave up as well. So I think we need to think about how do we resource and build up the other movements so that we're not focusing on that. And then, you know, I try to, you know, in my spiritual practice to also be like, okay, I'm going to come to you again fresh, and I'm going to try and hear you and see what you're doing. And I actually went to a talk with XR in the Netherlands. Actually, I just sat on the live stream, and they literally physically took the mic off one of the only Black people who spoke up 3 times, physically removed the mic. And so for me, that was like, this is white supremacy. If the only Black person who is in the space cannot speak in allyship, I cannot condone this organization. So at the same time, you know, I respect people who are trying to work within them and trying to do the trainings. But personally, you know, we are on a time crunch. I don't have another 10 years to maybe decolonize them. And then I think there are all sorts of questions about where is this money coming from? And initially, you know, in the strategy was to remove people like me, to remove long-term organizers so they could go for the normal people. So I think, you know, now we're here, we're at this moment, many people have come to the movement because of them. But what does a rapid redistribution of resources look like? Where do I send my emotional labor invoices? Why don't I have any money to do the work that I do, yet they're spending millions on PR campaigns and that? So I think that's the work of white allies. We can't be doing that work when we are trying to survive, grieve from COVID-19 and all of the other work we need to do. So yeah, I think, you know, and I always say, you know, the people who came through XR, who are showing up for Mother Earth, your intention is real, it's beautiful, but what we have to look at is what are the infrastructures and things that they're working on. And, you know, and I think a lot of these white supremacist behaviors are playing out in other places now where XR isn't respecting Indigenous rights, and they shouldn't have to add another principle to center climate justice. So that's where that's been a massive appropriation. And I think, you know, some of us tried to question them on the strategies. I wrote a op-ed in the Metro around the Canning Town protest, but a lot of those critiques didn't really go anywhere. So while I respect people who are trying to work within them and change that, I think white allies need to really sort of, yeah, rapidly redistribute those resources.
And there ends Suzanne's final word on XR, because I watch this all the time playing out, and I'm like, so you've heard it here first. Nobody's saying to you, don't do the work, but listen to the deeper reasons, right? Especially given how we've heard from so many different people the last few days, telling you how they are doing the work in their communities, both deeply and widely. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, when the recordings come out, go and listen to Araceli Camargo, go back and listen to Diana Rusin, go back and listen to Angie Tangeri, all over the world, different approaches, centering Black, Indigenous, people of colour principles, recognising that long emergency that so many people have been in, and go do the work. And white allies, go do the work, and everybody else carry on doing the work. And let's stop putting this conversation about what do you think about XR front and center all the time, because it is not helpful, it's not useful, and it just burns out. And I say that because I know that Suzanne's got quite a public profile, and when I see some of the things play out, I'm like, oh my God, like seriously. And then if you see that play out and you're a white ally, come in and just say, look, this is not the conversation. Why don't we talk about all the incredible work that is happening, like Suzanne said. So on that note, we've now got half an hour to carry on talking about the incredible work that you are doing. So we've got some questions from the audience, but first of all, I want to go into, let's get deep now. Let's start talking about what's going on and what's so important. So right, when you mentioned insurance and the insurance industry and what they're up to, some people would be completely like, wow, okay, yes, I know this. And some people be like, what's going on there? So tell us a little bit about your work around insurance and the insurance industry, and what are you sort of working on and campaigning for at the moment in that space?
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite topics because I'm a big nerd. So where I would talk about is, so the divestment work that has been happening to get, you know, showing shareholders the climate bubble, the carbon bubble, sorry, that is coming down the line, and that education work that's happened with it. The insurance work is an extension of that. So if you think about it, you know, if you're trying to get a company to divest from say the Keystone XL project, without having a wider financial shift, another company or another financier will just come in and finance that. So that's what we've seen happening. So even with divestment, when we're calling for divestment, we can't just ask for a single project to be stopped. We have to ask for changes in the lending policies and the policies around investment and free, prior and informed consent. That's a really big thing, that no projects can go ahead if they're illegal because they haven't had proper consultation. So when we're looking at that landscape of stopping financing, then what I found out and what I started to research was that actually, if you can stop insurance being able to be provided for a project, so no longer having insurance providers underwrite a project, it means that then they can't even get the financing. So it's kind of a shortcut. So I worked with an organization in Australia called Sunrise Project. What they came to me and said, well, can we seed this campaign in London first? So our first target was Lloyd's of London. So what we did was we trying to, you know, put pressure on Lloyd's and say, look, you know, the low-hanging fruit is coal, because coal is so carbon intensive. So if you can start underwriting coal, you can be on the pathway to climate justice as well. So we actually got that decision within like a few weeks. It was amazing. And we also did some big direct actions in insurance underwriters. And the thing that we found was insurance people actually already acknowledge climate change. Since the 70s, the insurance industry has acknowledged the reality of climate change, the need to address it, because, you know, that's the nature of insurance. You need to look at the reality of the situation. So I think there's a real potential there for allyship from those of you who work in financial services, to be encouraging those institutions to shift towards no longer doing coal underwriting. And then from that, we push that into tar sands. So tar sands is heavy fuel. It's like sticky black tar that needs to be mixed with water, gas. So it's very, very highly polluting, and it's also very price volatile. So the next thing that we're doing now is trying to get insurers to no longer underwrite tar sands. And so, but for me, what happens is that sometimes these campaigns, they get really cool, they get really popular, and they get co-opted. So what I'm trying to do now, and I'll be working with the Indigenous Environmental Network on this, is to make sure that we're pushing for policies that projects that don't respect Indigenous rights, that violate FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, those projects can't get underwritten. So that's kind of the takeaway from there, is that all the while that we're pushing for divestment, that we're pushing for these financial policies, make sure that they're embedded within a human rights framework, an Indigenous rights framework, because otherwise it's just like whack-a-mole. You're like getting one financier out of one project, but somebody else will come in there. And so, to be honest, I found so much movement, so much solidarity and momentum with that campaign.
That's really fascinating. Before we move away from that campaign, just so you talked about those working in finance can be allies on that. What would you recommend someone not working in finance, right? Someone who's an ally to the movement and is thinking, right, so what do I do now to kind of dig deeper into this? How can I support this, even if it's stuff within your own organization? What for people?
I think it's like looking at your own bank. Who are you banking with? Looking at your pension, if you have a pension, where is your pension invested in? And, you know, you can help shift the place that you work, your workplace, and even the conversations that come up from asking, well, who's our pension provider? That becomes a platform for you to have a conversation about climate justice, about human rights, about that. And it also frames it in a way that is agency as well. And then also looking at your insurance provider. Where are you getting your insurance from? And, you know, you have a role as like a consumer. I think sometimes that's more in American culture, but you do have a role as a consumer to push back on your financial institutions and to ask where they are. And then there is some great campaigns as well, you know, that have been happening by Sunrise Project, you know, despite everything, also 350, and a lot of those organizations that when they come out for calls for action, so supporting direct action. So if you are interested in doing direct action as well, and it can be non-violent, you know, supporting, exposing the banks, the corporations that are investing in that, but doing that research into those violations as well. And then I think also often there's not enough information on who to invest in, then who should I be getting my pension with, and that's something that we found that there was a gap in, and there's actually a gap between accessing the information about who are the good pension providers, who are the good things. So I think that's something as well. If you find out good policies, and make a tweet about it, like, oh, I just shifted my insurance from this to this because they're not underwriting coal. Use your sort of pound as a way of civic engagement as well, and then listen to the frontline communities when they say, you know, Barclays is investing in that, and support them with those actions, but always making sure that the requests that they have of the corporation are front and center, versus sometimes they can be naive, anarchist, anti-capitalist demands. But make sure when you're pushing financial institutions, you're aware of the things that the communities on the ground are specifically asking for. And I think that's a big concern with divestment, because, for instance, if you get Shell to divest from Nigeria, they'll be like, okay, well, we've also written off our obligation to clean up, to compensate. So those are some of the things, the technicalities around divestment, and also making sure that there's a reinvestment in that community as well.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that's really, really useful, because I think sometimes when you have access to this knowledge and you think, well, what are the practical steps, right? I know in our team, for example, we're really lucky to have a great FD and director of regenerative economics, who's like constantly reminding us about like and talking through why we've gone for a pension in a certain place, why we won't be buying new technology and we'll be refurbishing the technology, where we'll be spending that pound. He talks about it quite a lot, about circulating capital decisions. And this is by no means to say that we're like some golden beacon, because we're not, right? We still have like lots of moments of spend that I'm pretty much sure if we audited ourselves, we'd be like, yeah, this isn't cool. But we're on that journey and in that direction. And I'd say like, it's really good that you've mentioned that, because it reminds me, like, over the last 6 years of knowing him and working with him, it's front and center all the time, and it's uncomfortable sometimes. And I don't know what you think about this. So going back to the personal, sometimes like things that our parents and grandparents have done because they weren't in a position to like think about all of this, right? Like some of the ways in which buying new things was like linked to progress, or like the car, or, you know, like there was just things, right, that now my parents for sure are kind of like, oh yeah, we don't want to do that. But when I was younger, that was like a moment of like, we've done well, and so now we're going to do this next thing. And so what I found over the last 5 or 6 years is being able to go into that like journey really properly, to like not shame my parents and grandparents for their decisions. They weren't even able to question because they were trying to survive, and they were, you know, in that moment of figuring out what progress looked like in a country that didn't want them to progress or whatever. And then like being in growing this organization now where like lots of things Andy will often tell me like are uncomfortable. I'm like, okay, so that means we have to change this thing, right? And we have to spend differently, or some are more comfortable, you know, where we put our pensions, who we bank with. It's been quite a dichotomy. And so I've got a question on this. It's not just a random stream of consciousness. But so I want to reiterate that point to anyone who's watching. Like, there is a massive role of you talking about where you buy your utilities and your services from, where your insurances and your pensions, because I mean, I just search around, and when someone says to me that something's more better, I just move. That's it. I just move within that next year and keep moving until we get closer. So it makes a big difference to what we can do, and they're starting to be on par price wise as well, right? So we're starting to get to the point where the cost isn't a big difference. And then the other thing I was going to say was, so don't forget your like individual autonomy, and then your autonomy within like work and the power you can have if you run in an organization to question your where you're spending that money. Two follow-on questions, and then so I'm going to go in sections now, right? So I want to know about your personal journey of balancing all of that, right? You say you come from a Sikh Punjabi family. I'm sure there's like a lot of overlaps that we can discuss there. But let's go back a second. When you talk about investments and pensions and insurance and all of that, where do you see the role of philanthropy and their endowments in that? Because I feel like a lot of the UK independent philanthropy scene grow their endowments hugely and massively. We don't see how big their endowments grow very transparently. We also don't know where they're both historically got their money from and what they're investing in now. Do you have any insights on that? And if you don't, it's completely fine. But I just feel like there's a big space in which we're sitting in a massive contradiction.
Yeah, I think it's a big question. And I think it's also, I don't know, it's a privilege to be in the contradiction. Like, for instance, you know, some of the funders at the beginning that I had were connected to like a large tar sands group, and some of them were connected to Hewlett-Packard, and some organisers wouldn't take funding from them, and we did wrestle with that at the beginning, and then we did take funding because we were like, well, we need to scale up the work. And, you know, and we've tried to always take, you know, money from Lush or like Joseph Rowntree, liberal, you know, well-aligned organisations with us. And I think that's reached a limit as well, because even accessing those funds is so difficult now. So I think we have to be careful. I think, yeah, definitely, obviously, there is like blood money. But, you know, the people who are often questioning that are often the ones who already have like a salary or a setup and a base. And it's just like, okay, well, we need to be questioning about, are we all resourced? Well, then are we redistributing the money around our organizations as well? And I think so we need to continually, the reason why we need to question where the money's coming from, I think, is more so even more than like if it's blood money or dirty money, or it's because how does that impact the strategies? So for instance, for a long time, tar sands was cool with the funders, so we were getting funding, but then it switched, and then fracking was cool, so suddenly fracking got loads of funding. So I think that's why we need to look at how the non-profit industrial complex works in terms of philanthropy, and who gets in favour and who comes into it, and why does it decide what's happening in our movement as well. So I don't necessarily know about how we, and there is no clean money really, how we put that pressure on people. Why does that pressure often go more on women of colour? That sort of like, yeah, we're supposed to be completely pristine in that. And so I think there's questions around where we question it and why we question it as well. But we definitely still need to go through, I think, like a more of a trickle down of that. Yeah,
definitely.
I haven't figured it all out.
No, I agree with that, because I think that work is a transition, right? Because if you start saying, okay, well, we're not going to take money from anywhere, then you've literally got nowhere to take money from, because it's none of it's like super clean. There's some good work happening, I know, with Esme Fairbairn, for example, where they're like questioning their endowment from the inside, to really look at what's going on there. And I think, as you said before, that's definitely work of allies to campaign and do that work, but I think and it's part of that transition, but I also agree about the complex of philanthropy, the industrial complex of philanthropy, playing power, like you said, deciding what's cool and what's in favor. And I think that's a huge issue. And I'm going to go to some questions from the audience, and some comments from them, and then ask some more of my own questions. So we were in insurance, so let's go to Andy. Andy says, do you feel the growth in ESG and impact investments in the pension investment sphere is a sign of hope for this, and what would you do to push it further? And he also said he's sorry that his question was delayed when you're talking about it. He's playing with his daughter.
I actually can't answer that.
Okay.
I can find someone who can answer it for you, and I will email you with that.
I love that. Thank you, Suzanne, because I love it when people say, "No, I don't know. I'll tell you someone who can." Because to be honest, I was reading the question word by word because I was like, I actually don't even know what Andy's talking about. So, so hopefully, Andy, you can give us some insight into that, and also connect with Suzanne, because I think you're going to become friends over insurance, which is great. Isn't it? So Dominic talks about trying to increase transparency at Lankelly Chase about where the money's from, where it is and what it's doing now, which is really exciting. And he says he agrees that there's no clean money. And yeah, on that, Dominic, completely agree. No, Andy, don't apologise at all. We're good. We understand. I was rating for saying I don't know. But what I was going to say, go on.
Just respond to that question. I think, you know, often we're looking like, what is the source of the money? Where is it coming from? I think that's really important to do, definitely. But I think also, you know, future orientated, that we're pushing for changes in lending policy. For instance, in Canada, TD Canada Trust literally changed its policy where it can't give any lending to any project that doesn't respect Indigenous rights. So I think as well as going backwards, we have to go forwards as well, so that we're pushing for new financial policies as well. And I think that's where you can get more motivation as well. I'm not saying that we should let them, you know, off the hook for it, but if you're trying to engage a financial institution, showing them the roadway forward. And I think that's part of being a trendsetter in this space. It was about being like, look, Lloyds, you can do this awesome thing, go in this direction. And obviously anti-capitalism is a bigger thing, but in terms of when we're trying to be proactive, I think that's one way to do it. Like, give them a little carrot to hang, to like, hey, go for the carrot.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that as well. And yeah, I was just saying that Dominic, in response to Dominic's comments, great tactics from Suzanne about, you know, not only looking at where it's coming from, but like, what is it that you're doing with your investment and lending in that is really great practical advice. And to say that completely I've been proximate to like some good examples of what people are trying to do. And it's interesting because I worry sometimes that like organizations, funders, particularly in the philanthropic space, will get so into kind of like, well, where has my money come from, that they'll forget that one of the most powerful things they could do with that knowledge is like redirect it. One of the things I just haven't seen in COVID-19 is that the scale of the data about what's happening to certain communities is matching the scale of redirecting large endowments to those communities. So I kind of feel like sometimes this is just me, just like on a stream of consciousness. I sometimes feel like the act of sharing all of that and the transparency of all of it is where people think the work is finished, as opposed to going, okay, now with that knowledge and the data that we have, what are you doing with that money? Like, where's it going to now go proportionally or disproportionately if you found out that you've got that money through extracting it through generations and generations of abusive extraction?
I think that's a really good point. And I have a funder that I work with quite closely and I advise, and they're a new generation that have taken on their family's money and being like, okay, we're going to do this properly now, and working with them to redistribute it. So I think there is a generational shift that's happening. But then I also think it's about the speed of the money and the fact that the way the nonprofit industrial complex is set up, like, you know, when COVID hit, it wasn't from anyone in the climate justice movement that supported me. Like at the beginning, I didn't even have enough money for food when I was ill. And it was actually queer artists who I knew who were PayPaling me 50 quid. Some guy I knew from like a webinar I went to sent me money for food. So literally that mutual aid, the speed at which money gets to the front line. And, you know, most of the things that I've done in my career have not been funded. There've been things that I've known need to happen and need to come up. And so that's also about how do we build a more a flexible entrepreneurial space in this work. Like, for instance, and I'm just going to bring up the cyclone, for instance. There was a cyclone that happened not long ago, just a few weeks ago, that impacted 10 million people across Bangladesh, India and Nepal, and wiped out an entire Sundarbans ecosystem. There was not a single response to that, both from the climate justice community or from the social justice community. You know, I think 350.org tweeted about it and said, this is why we need a new Green Deal. help our campaign. You know, that literal work of what I call critical climate care, that humanitarian response to the disasters isn't happening. So every time a disaster happens like that, I'm having to be like a nut job on my Insta stories, just sharing it, getting it out, getting influence to share it. Where are the, you know, I would love to work with app developers, people who we can build around this culture that might not shift enough quickly to respond to the actual needs on the ground. So I think that's a real thing about recentering care as well into the climate movement, because it becomes about parts per million. It becomes about this new Green Deal that those people will never even get to experience. You know, they're literally trying to get Ruti, trying to get Seva. So I was trying to amplify Khalsa Aid at that point, Mukti Web, these are all on my Twitter that you can find. So that's a real question for me, and what I've been trying to hold in my heart. And what was really interesting, and I think this is a question for us as a community, that there wasn't actually any response either within the British Asian community, and yet when Black Lives Matters and the situation happened with George Floyd, it kicked off. And 3000% that needs to happen. We need to address anti-Blackness and white supremacy. But it's a question for me about why are our communities disconnected from our own roots? And we also have, you know, layers of oppressions within us, you know, as a queer woman, as you know, those of us come from Rajasthan or Punjab or Bangladesh, like there's all of these complexities, and so we also need spaces to come back now, I think, to ourselves and say, why were we able to respond to that and we couldn't respond to that? And not that they're mutually exclusive, but just sort of thinking about how the media, how social media activates our empathy and our care, and so I think that's a question, I think, for us coming into our communities again, and that becomes the role of media makers and social media makers. How can we support that care and that amplification, and how can we have responsive networks that will respond to this? Because at the moment, a lot of the big NGOs, you know, MSF is over here, 350.org is over here. They aren't talking to each other about how critical climate care, how catastrophes are responded to. They're acting in silos. So for me, that's a space of transformation that we need in this work. And I think that's why I love being in spaces like this, of working outside of the normal activist spaces, because we need engineers, app developers, humanitarians, and a new kind of work in this moment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Suzanne. And I completely echo that. The act of pitting our movements against each other that's a colonial concept in itself, right? The idea that if you care about Black Lives Matter, you can't care about something else, right? Or that if you mention one, it means the others. Or if you mention, do you know what I mean? Like, this is, we just need to move away from this, because we can be in solidarity across multiple struggles. And I have to say that when you sent me the Amphan cyclone stuff, and I've had a lot going on in my own personal life, so I haven't as necessarily been as active, particularly on stuff. But when you sent it to me, I was like, I couldn't get my head around what's happened here, right? I'm pretty sure, and I don't know whether this was naive, but I'm pretty sure when I was younger, a catastrophe of that scale would happen and there would be a humanitarian response, right? I'm pretty sure that would be the thing. I'd turn on my TV and then, even just a few years ago, even just 5 minutes, and then I was trying to think, right, am I going mad? Am I going mad and this is not true? Or are things getting so desensitized to the stage where, not even desensitized actually, forget that, because we're not desensitized. Is the media and what we're consuming getting to a point where it's like, yeah, now that's not important enough, right? We're not gonna put that as a campaign that comes on your TV, or the thing that, you know, even the most traditional way of getting the mainstream to know massive catastrophes are happening. Is it that they're happening more and more? Is it an act of division to not be sharing them? But I haven't got to the bottom of this. All I know is that I've got everything you sent me bookmarked and I share it, but I can't make sense of why was this not mega news.
Yeah, I think I've got a few thoughts. one is actually a personal story, is something happened to me. It was like 2 nights before it happened. These ants came into my room in the bulb. Hundreds of ants came in and died in this bulb. I was like, what the hell has just happened? And the way that I've been taught with Indigenous spirituality and my climate work is that I take messages from animals and insects very seriously. So when this happened, I was really disturbed. I was like, something's going on. Like, I'm being told to pay attention. And then when I saw the cyclone, I was like, whoa, that is like that feeling of this mass death. And like, these ants wouldn't stop bothering me. And I was like, oh my God, if I don't do something, these ants aren't going to leave me alone. So literally it was like this, this impetus, and I couldn't sleep. I was like, I've got to do something. What am I going to do? And it was so horrific. I turned to the artists who were coming out at the time, and they were sharing such beautiful art. And I thought, you know, psychologically, I can keep sharing art. And I also don't want to traumatize our communities who are dealing with COVID right now with this. And I think what it comes down to is the climate illiteracy, the movement of XR and Greta, not herself individually, because my brother's autistic. I respect her as what she's doing, but as a campaign tool that she's been used to, it's created a climate illiteracy. You know, now we equate climate change with eco-fashion, with, you know, changing our plastics. There was this movement backwards from actually being about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, about the gender justice, about the eco side. And so that's when I talk about the devastation of XR and Greta that it's done to our movement. It's removed that climate literacy where we were trying to talk about climate catastrophes and the people who would be on that radar. And so I think that's where we're in this moment now, where we need to re-educate ourselves about the climate movement, what is happening. And then I think it's also, it was the timing. I think it was a funny time around what was happening with COVID. There was specifically a media blackout. And also there was like a social media blackout, which is a different thing than a media blackout, like what catches on. And for some reason it wasn't catching on. And I tried, and I think it did a little bit. But I think it's also, again, it comes back to, I think this is where we have to take responsibility as people of colour. Like, and that is part of colonialism. You know, colonialism kept the history from us about what happened in Amritsar in 1984. It kept that history from us. You know, I only learned that from seeing a painting by the Singh sisters. We're all on a journey of understanding that. So why are we disconnected from our siblings back home? Why do we not see that as an issue? And also this disconnection, like you're saying, like humanitarian disasters over here and climate, you know, Stella McCartney and Going Green is over here. So bringing those back together, bringing us back into that moment, and resourcing the people like myself, those of us who have been kicked out of the movement because we've been trying to bring that. We need to be resourced again so that we can actually do that. Yeah, just keep calling it critical climate care. So there needs to be a re-envisioning of what climate movement work looks like this, and a question for ourselves in a safe way between ourselves, and like you said, to not pit the movements against each other. But it's connected to the anti-blackness in our communities. It's connected to the, you know, there was also a blackout on the fascism that's happening back in India. You know, like a lot of POC, DESI influencers are more interested in diversity. So diversity means we get in vogue with our bindis, and the actual deep work of decolonizing as that. And I found a lot of people who've come in from that space of like removed those of us who are trying to push deeper. So there's a lot of work we need to do within our communities ourselves to think about that question as well.
Thank you. That was brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And I'd say, there's a much deeper conversation here that needs to happen within our communities, but also we need to like reflect on ourselves about what's making that disconnection even worse, right? Because we can blame lots of historical structures, things that have erased so much from our actual histories. We talk about 1984, like there's a whole history behind that goes back like nearly 100 years. And one of the most brutal parts of that history is how the museums and literature were destroyed through multiple attacks. So our own history has been destroyed. But you can find out more about this, that particular example with an organisation that a good friend of mine runs, it's called Insaaf, ENSAAF. So if you're a Punjabi or a Sikh watching this and you're like, yo, what have they just, or if you're just generally interested, right, about what's going on, have a look on their website, because they've got loads of stories about all of that. I'm going to take the last question that I can fit in from the audience, and then we'll start to wrap up. So Kavita says, hi, Suzanne. I'm an environmental process engineer, and I'm vocal in my workplace as the only woman of colour regarding environmentalism and the role of white patriarchal supremacy in that field too. So hearing your intro, I felt that. Thank you. What are your thoughts on the role of heavy industry in the climate crisis and justice, especially considering for renewable tech to be manufactured, the mining, processing and metallurgy and further processing and manufacture? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a few phases to it. And I think, you know, first and foremost, we have to stop the most destructive. So we have to immediately halt any further extraction of bitumen, of heavy oil. And I think, you know, we have to be careful that we don't go into this kind of spin of like, well, we're going to have to extract for some of the renewable technology so that we just continue as business as usual. So I think it's about stopping the worst things first immediately, and protecting those communities who are trying to stop that on the ground. And then I think it's about also decolonizing the technologies that are moving forward, and and that means about the intellectual work around that as well. Like a lot of Indigenous communities that I work with are also technicians and engineers who are trying to develop renewable processes for their health centres. So how can we work with traditional knowledge keepers to build solutions that work with traditional ecological knowledge, as well as like moving forward with that technological process, and moving out of that idea that if it's traditional ecological knowledge, it's backwards, or it's about going back into the cave, but also understanding that there are people that are working at that intersection as well. And there's a really good book that I'll share afterwards, which does go into this, that, you know, there is going to be issues around steel and lithium. I think lithium's a really good example. You know, we know that part of the coup that happened in Bolivia was to get lithium for Tesla and for Germany. And so Indigenous communities are being removed from their territories to get lithium for renewable energy. So I think we do really need to map out what is the ground impacts of those renewable energies as well. And so, you know, obviously we need to move forward with them, but there needs to be some kind of part of that conversation as well.
Thanks so much, Suzanne. I could carry on talking to you forever, like for hours about questions. So I'm not going to do that to you, because look at what you can go and enjoy outside. But I was going to say a couple of things. One, you know, thank you for just sharing the knowledge, right? Like for you, this is something you've been working for such a long time on, and so many people are like catching up and often having to like go back and be like, right, okay, this is why things matter and stuff. Is like quite a labor in itself. And I want to say thank you for doing that, and for chatting to me this afternoon. Also, thank you for so many like practical things that you have also talked about. And whilst I'm just sharing this next little bit, I wanted to ask you to think about what you'd like to leave us with, like where you see hope, or where what keeps you going, what's driving you to get up every day, and what could like a more sort of dream scenario look like in your mind. And while you're just looking that up, right, I'm just going to say this here because I think it's really important, and I keep saying it in nearly every session. So in like my community, we often think about elders as like people who are older, obviously, like your older generation, but also elders in like practice and wisdom and work and like what they've done. And I'm just perplexed, right, that someone who is doing the work that you're doing and has stuck by this for as long as you have, and is dealing with especially like root causes. We are really interested in that in the work we do around like systemic change. Like, how do you get to the right leverage point? And for example, the insurance example that you talked about is such a good leverage point, because it's a shortcut to just so many other things, rather than trying to do the whack-a-mole of trying to get different finances to finance stuff. Like, it's just mind-blowing to me, and I'm mainly talking to the audience here, that work like this has to play in the game of being constantly relevant to funders and constantly like knowing how to completely carry on doing that dance of how do I get funding for this year, or how do I, and I just want you to, like, because I know there's some funders in this and there's some that are listening back and that some are who are paying attention. Like, I want to understand like how you work on yourselves to resource this work, right? To stop making us and people like us and people like Suzanne have to play a game to justify why resource matters for this movement and this work, and you know what it means for funders to do the work, to understand that you don't have, that there's multiple things that aren't just in vogue right now, and what that means. And I invited Suzanne on for a number of different reasons, because I feel like she talks about so many important things all the time, and then I'm fascinated by why so little of that is getting the attention that, you know, the mainstream climate movement is. So yeah, if you're like passionate about centering women of colour in the movement, you know, get the resources, investment to them. And I'm talking to all of you who are out there listening to this in lots of ways with deep respect. It's not an attack on you. It's never an attack on you. It's an attack on a system that carries on doing this and makes it so hard for the work to be sustainable and work at pace. And on that note, that's my daily rant to the sector. I'd like to hand back to you, Suzanne, and just ask you to just share, you know, what would you like to leave us with?
Yeah, and I think it was really important, I think, and healing for me to have this conversation with you, because, you know, we know that there's white supremacy, that, like you said, why don't I know more about what you've been doing? Why isn't it be getting out? But it's also been within my own community. It's been from POC men within leadership positions who have stopped me from speaking out. There's been lateral violence. So I think us having spaces to come together, I feel like a bit of an elder now, you know, bringing this knowledge to the forefront is really important. So when you're addressing funders, that means we also need resourcing to have conferences, spaces like this that are primarily for ourselves, to heal ourselves, to come back together and to undo that damage of white supremacy as well within our spaces. I think getting really flexible, of getting quicker resources to people, and changing what we think that the work looks like. So that means that, yeah, doing a bit of research. Like, I'm not always promoting what I do because I find it kind of cringy, like that whole activism, celebrity stuff, but also supporting people, like profiling them so that they can get the resources to go there. And I think, you know, you asked me what keeps me going, and this can sound really cheesy, but it's literally love. Like, I love the earth, I love the land, I love the communities that I work for, and I wouldn't have kept going for all these years with the lateral violence, the systemic violence that I faced, and definitely spirituality. And, you know, and I've brought myself here to this place right now because I feel lost. I actually feel lost. I don't know how, if my own community didn't respond to that cyclone, like, how can I keep doing this work? So I've really come here to, like, yeah, be with God, be with spirit, get the next instructions. So also healing. How do you get mental health support to people? You know, how do you get them to, you know, I was thinking here, oh my God, could we build a retreat center for us here so we can come here and we can heal? So thinking about all those soft ways that you can move resources faster, you know, as well, like, yeah, so just becoming nimble, becoming quicker. And also, I think I often say everyone is an activist. Now, we've moved into this new dimension, which is actually an amazing possibility, where we don't have to keep critiquing exile, we don't have to keep critiquing the non-profit industrial complex, because we're in this new renaissance where we, like I said, we need new collaborators, new ways of working, decolonial innovation. So I think it's really an opportunity for you to step into this space, even if you hadn't considered yourself a part of it, and how much impact you can have at this point, to invest in thinkers and artists doing this work.
Thank you so much, and I hope those of you who are in the audience that can, like, support Suzanne in loads of ways, and like Suzanne is an example of 100 other people I could tell you that are going through this same struggle of like just figuring out like, what do we do, right? Do we have to make ourselves celebrities? Do we have to make ourselves palatable to funding? Like, this is not unusual. This is everywhere. So I just want to say, however you can carry the work, however you can resource the work, and however you can support the organizations that Suzanne runs and the work she does, then just do, right? That's the whole point of Department of Dreams. We can't be moving towards the future and to these bold visions if we're literally losing people who are doing the work along the way through burnout and lack of resource. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Suzanne, and I hope you enjoy that glorious, beautiful weather. And thanks to everybody who's joining us in the chat and on the stage today. We've got another session at 2:00 with Alia Hassina. It's going to be just fun. Sit back, eat your food, enjoy it. It's a music video, desert island disc style music videos that helped you see the future with a bunch of incredible artists. So tune in. So thank you so much. Thank you for the comments, and take care, Suzanne. Loads of love.
Bye.